As promised, we reconvene again for a panel, and while I reintroduce Bianca Wiley from Toronto, we are now joined to heighten the complexity by Eik van Emmeren from Amsterdam and Martin Brinskov from Denmark. Eik van Emmeren is public tech lead at the Chief Technology Office of the City of Amsterdam, leading Amsterdam's public tech program aiming to make new technology work for all residents. Eik is responsible for a variety of innovative projects in public space, infrastructure, and the governmental organization itself. For example, working on Amsterdam's blockchain pilots, such as the Decode project, the technology roadmap Beyond the Hype, and kickstarting Amsterdam's AI strategy. I'm looking forward to hear all about that. Martin Brinskov is associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark and chair of the Global Open and Agile Smart Cities Initiatives. OASC encompasses more than 150 cities from 31 countries. It aims to develop so-called minimal interoperability mechanisms for cities and communities. Dr. Martin Brinskov is also the director of the Center for Digital Transformation of Cities and Communities and a global expert, speaker, and advisor on IoT and smart cities. So just at the right place with us, with a human-centric focus. I'd like to start with the panel with a quote that I recently found. It was coined by Richard Sennett, and he said, "What's emerging in this pandemic are good programs and protocols which create community. Is it an automatism?" I was asking myself. And I wanted to know more about your work that you're doing by starting with values in open government that maybe also play a role in your daily work, which are transparency, social participation that we heard a bunch about already, accountability, and technological innovation. It can start, whoever wants to start can start. How do they relate to your work? Can you give a concrete example of recent projects, challenges, and successes? And how does international cooperation, iteration, and peer learning intersect with your work? Martin, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, thanks. That's a lot of questions. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thanks for the invitation also from the city of Hamburg, equivalent to the size of the country of Denmark, which I'm currently in. Thank you also, Bianca, for the enlightenment here in the beginning. I think the fundamental question is exactly what Bianca said. How do we make technology available for political discussion? That's the first question. Then how do we make the technologies that we use to infrastructure our societies, our communities, receptive and resonating, that situation that we want? We have spent centuries, millennia, in fact, infrastructuring our societies and organizing in a way which kind of works with the current technologies. Now data is tearing that up. So I see that's what's happening. So the sad message is we don't have to fix technology only. Actually, we have to rewire society, which does not mean rewire people or reinvent a new planet. So it's really, really a challenge. Even if we just want to do something good in Hamburg or in a community or in a global region, even the planet. So even if it's maybe technology that is to blame for what's happening, because data knows no borders, there are no mobility data and health data. There is just data like air. So I think we have to recognize that's really a challenge fundamentally. And the work that I do and we do is then to follow up on the political aims. So when we know what we want technology we can govern, okay? We want to save the planet, we want to be a healthy society, we want communities to thrive, we want good lives. Then what is the response from the technology side? Because we also need to design appropriate technologies. And our focus is, if we want something to work in a way in a global scale and also a very, very local scale, it probably has to be something quite minimal. There is no grand design to suddenly fix this. So that would be my starting point. What are the smaller mechanisms? And then what are the procedures? Because this is going to take decades that we then unfold. And then we are back to the political processes, the community discussions. What are the discussions? We heard about the maker culture. What is the co-creation there? Really institutional co-creation alongside with the technology development. So I think if that makes sense, that's my starting point.
That is a very good starting point. I was also interested in how cities can play an important role in model crisis responses that might be important also in the long term, like not only in this crisis, but what are the big challenges that municipalities face at the moment, in your opinion?
First of all, I think the very big shift comes when you get tired of stuff that doesn't work. If you have the luxury situation, yeah, do some innovation projects, do some things. But when we have the Corona situation, you want stuff that works. So you cut the crap and you get down to business. The difficult, using data across organizations, across sectors. This is first felt in cities. I think that's the primary role of cities, to being the first responder to this global, you could say, data pandemic. The frustration. We don't know how to govern data. But a city is not one sector. It's not e-government or something like that. It's all sectors coming together. We call it the cocktail effect of technology. And that's first felt where you have these dense populations within somehow a governance sphere. So that would be, for me, the first response, like we see from Hamburg, from Amsterdam, and so many other wonderful cities. That is, I think, the main contribution, that there is a response and there is a felt need to actually do something that works long term.
Thank you so much for that insight. Bianca, I was wondering, connected to your keynote, does digitization equal access, and does participation also secure quality and resilience? So Shoshana Zuboff coined the term unilateral incursion into undefended spaces. What are these spaces in cities that need to be mapped out and defended?
Yeah, and it's such and before I say anything else, I just want to double down on all of what Martin said. And I think like these pieces around the city, and I'm sure Ike will have some of this as well, like the truth of how this all lands in the city, I think is so fundamental, right? Because I think policy at least in Canada, I sat around and, you can talk about international data things, you can talk nationally, you can talk regional, provincial, which is often where the power is. And we have a lot of federal legislation that trickles down to the city. And so this, to get back to your question, Katarina, it's the governance piece that for me is quite concerning. I think that incursion, the assumptions that are made when technology is designed without participation, and then you get the cities in this sort of defensive and their residents in a mitigating frame, in like okay, just make sure it doesn't do that, or make sure it doesn't do this, and then you've lost the opportunity to design. So I think the incursion into the governance of these technologies, it happens in a very, it's hard to hold on to it, because it's, you look at maybe the physical instantiation of like what the sensor does, or, like you see the physical places where the technology may be operating, but the governance piece, because it's abstract, is harder to hold on to, I find. So for me, the incursion into how these systems work and why that should be coming from a commercial, and it's so important to hold on to this. Saying that something is commercial, there's nothing inherently negative about it. It's just different than the responsibility that a state, and whether it's a city government or anyone else, has to serve everybody the same. This is their responsibility when they, as provision of public service, public infrastructure. That is not the motivation when you have a commercial interest. It's just not. And so these are the pieces in terms of equity that we have to think about, is what technology has created in cities, which I find quite troubling, is for some of the people that live in cities, some of the technologies are just fine because they don't implement or affect their lives in negative ways. The harms aren't borne by everybody the same. So the thing is that as a resident, sometimes you're supporting a system, and I keep going back to negligence over malice often, is people just don't know the negative impacts of some of the things that they may think are a good idea because they're fine for themselves, right? So I think that those conversations around how technology impacts people, we're not having them to the extent we should. And that's where we have a problem with this sort of incursion, because it's like once someone gets excited about something and then that momentum builds, I'm so tired of residents having to feel that they're on the defensive. As a technologist, I want them to feel excited about what technology affords them, right? But everybody, and then you need to be around the table for that. And I don't think it happens when the frame is, how do we react or respond always, instead of how do we design and build out. And just one other point on this, I was looking and I can't find it. I will find it. There was a piece written by Niels Gilman and a colleague of his around the last couple of decades and operational expertise going way down, and all these sort of idea people becoming the people that the governments listen to, the sort of idea economy. And I think that's critical to acknowledge, is that cities have deep operational expertise, and that needs to inform how we think about technologies. I just want to always remember, it's like we're forgetting how much knowledge sits within the cities and how many cities have had to do so much with so little already. Like we need to honor that expertise. And I think that this corporate narrative doesn't honor that. It actually makes the city look like, oh, you're slow, or oh, you're behind, or oh, you're, and I it's our job to stand up, I think, as technologists, to support the city. And that's, that there's a lot more democracy we need to do in there. But I think those are the things that come to mind with that question in that prompt.
What comes to mind immediately is also agency. And I think to elaborate on agency a bit, it is good to also invite Ike to the conversation. My question would be, in Amsterdam, in which specific cases and how do you crowdsource or enable participation? Are there model projects that perpetuate the exertion of control through transparency and deliberation? And how are these related to meta concepts and institutions like the European Union and the digital sovereignty framework?
I do really like the question, because I think it's a new area for the conversation we're having. We're really used of participation when it comes to how do we build in neighborhoods, or when it comes to the T areas we have for elderly people. We're used of having everyone engaged. When it comes to technology, we're not. We don't have any clue. One of the main examples where we're searching for participation and we're doing is, what kind of digital society do we want to build? What is the public space we want to create together? And who's in control, or who is shaping that environment? And of course, it's about the MIM standards that you introduced, Martin, with. It's about the balance between what do you build yourself as a government, or what do citizens do, or what the large companies do. But I think the bottom line is, when it comes to technology, it's really hard. We don't have given the answer yet on what kind of digital society do we want to build together. And the specific case in Amsterdam is that for the last few years, the debate is growing on this topic. We now got a vice mayor on digital city, and this really fast forwards the debate. We've got political questions in our city parliament about the use of technology. Is it right what we use, or can we fast forward? So for years, I would have given different examples. I would have said, okay, we're really good at participatory budgeting, like a lot of other cities, and we're really great at that. Or I'm really proud that the policy we opened up and everyone can join, and we're including everyone who knows stuff about these standards, and let's have this conversation together. But I think it's more complex than that, and I think that's the next phase. How do we talk about, and that's why I really like having this talk with Bianca and Martin in this conversation, because I'm really impressed what Google did in Toronto, shaping a whole town together with everyone, but on false. Some mistakes were made. Bianca can elaborate more on that. So how do we do this in a correct way? How do we engage everyone? when we're building a digital city, how do we engage people, enable participation, etc. And when it comes to institutions, and that's where it gets complicated, and that's why I'm referring to Martin. As a city, if you look at my background, it's in Dutch for keep your grandma off the intensive care. Our role is we're the most connected with citizens. So we know if we're talking about algorithms, we can have conversations with people about how does it affect your life. When you're a picture of you don't want to have put online is there and you want to take it off, we're the government you're calling, but we cannot do anything about it. So that's where institutions like the EU and others come in. So we have to design this together, but we're the first facing the problems with normal people. And I think the last one is, and that's the bad thing, is that we're not able to meet in one room, because that always improves the quality. But the good thing is there's a Dutch book, and that's the thing about having a mirror screen. It's a book about one of our politicians, and he wrote like, you cannot live in bullshit. If you want to build a house, you can design all the structures you want, but in the end, you have to have a door and the windows, etc. And that's also about this debate. I mean, in the end, what are we doing? So how do you come from standards to what's actually used for citizens? And I think that's really important. The question you asked.
Yeah, and if I may build on that and maybe ask Martin a question, because I think the balance that I'm always struggling with, and this comes from public consultation, is what do you put on the table for resident citizen debate, and what don't you put on the table? And this to me is about the role of the expert. And here sometimes I feel like it's getting over torqued into consultation, when that actually, like, if people are showing up to a couple meetings a year, it's not right to put that control into a sort of space where the education, the literacy, the understanding of the topic is not high. And I say that as someone who's always learning myself. I'm not suggesting, that I'm not in that group. So for me, and Martin, I'm curious on your take on this, because what I did a lot of in consultation was remind governments that the 200 mad people in the room, they're not in charge. They're a factor in your decision-making process, and you have to explain to them how you're making decisions and how you take their input into consideration. But they're not writing the policy, and they're not writing the laws. And so I'm curious, Martin, what you think about that, because I am concerned, say in Canada, that some of these conversations, you put digital in front, and there's almost like it's almost like we're forgetting all the big job of government. And there's all this excitement. And then there's also a lot of dishonesty about the state of the legacy affairs of our technology systems. I don't know if that's a special to Canada. I don't think it is from my experience. But then you start pretending you don't have some of these problems because the government's scared to admit the hairball or spaghetti monster that is existing systems. So Martin, I know there's a few pieces in there. I'm just curious what you think, because I think this conversation really is about the difference between the role of the expert and how does the resident participate, because we need to frame that properly. Yep. So Martin, do you have thoughts on that?
So the center I'm working in, it's called the Center for Digital Transformation in Cities and Communities, not of cities and communities. So I think that gives sort of a partly the answer. Another part of our center is the participatory IT center. So we've done in Scandinavia participatory processes and design, of course, since ages. And like I won't say that's solved. I would still say two things. It's down to ensuring that we still have a political process around our decisions. And the other thing is time. We should not walk into a room, pretend these idea people, as you say, Katharina, hey, we figured it out. Now we just implement. And yeah, sure, we implemented with you, we co-create. I think that would be dishonest. Like you also say, Ike, and this is why I admire Amsterdam and Hamburg, the examples here on the table, because you're open about your doubts. And I think we have to be. So I live in a city where the railroad tracks were just taken out of the city because they were dividing. They're basically cutting off the city from the sea. That was a decision made a long time ago, and it was probably good for economy. It was a good decision but there were ramifications. So I think we have to do like what you reflect from Amsterdam, have it very high on the policy agenda. So ensure that these decisions, first of all, have visibility on those who orchestrate the political process and the inclusiveness of the political process, the kind of partners. If we have time, I think there's a very interesting discussion about, the market, because cities do not necessarily build themselves, right? So there has to be a market around this. But I think, hinging this on a high political level in cities, and as you say, on multi-levels, because actually the federal level or the state level, depending on the size of your country, we don't have so many levels here in Denmark, but in Germany and Canada for sure. You then have, maybe you have the power to not do something or do something. And I think it's to have this multi-level governance over time with people who recognize both the potential, of course, but also the intricacies, the possible technology debt that we are imposing on those who come after us. So I think we have to balance, short-term careers, political cycles, things we can do meaningfully in 1 or 2 years, and then how are we infrastructure our societies? And that's not for each and every city or community to figure out by ourselves. So I think this openness in also sharing the learnings so we can build on each other's mistakes and on each other's learnings. I mean, clearly Europe is now proposing a very ambitious framework for this for the next 7 years, as an example. I think the multi-level governance, projected into time, decades. I think that's the very boring answer, if it's an answer. Thank you for the question, Bianca.
We talked about dynamics a little bit, and let's open up the floor. And I'm asking Hannes over in Hamburg, are there questions from the audience at this point that we could integrate into the panel?
Good morning to the panel. Yes, there is actually. So there is a few questions from the audience that reached us through menti.com, and I want to take two main points out, because earlier, starting from the introduction already, we talked a lot about what is going on in the big cities and the packed municipalities. But then there's also a growing divide between those municipalities and the rural areas. So what, in terms of digitization, can be done to overcome this divide between the big city, the growing city, and the rural area? And also, within the cities, there is more segregation going on. The different areas of the city are more and more segregated. So in terms of digitization, is there also something that can be done to overcome the segregation of the city itself?
If I maybe I can give a small example in Amsterdam, because I think this is a really important question, and I think there are a lot of questions within this question, but one is about digital divide. There's a lot of talk on digital divide. We just opened, or actually in a few weeks, the real opening is there. It's the Civic AI Lab, and that's where Senna Geyrip, one of I hope he's becoming one of the most famous Dutch professors, because his work is really important. Because we're talking a lot about digital divide, but where is it actually happening? Can we put numbers and figures to it? Where is this divide? Because it's about talking about divide, but where is it actually happening, and can we do something about it? In the physical infrastructure, the example of Martin, the railroad, that's something you can take apart, and then you can just go to the other side. What does it mean from the digital perspective? So that's one part, research on where is actually this digital divide. And on the other hand, of course, we already know a lot of stuff. It's about digital literacy. It's about inclusive design. It's about, and I think it's a lot of stuff we as a collective, and I think people in Hamburg are not different to any other city. We already know answers like what's good design, etc., but we don't. It's really complex to implement it, and I think that's the same when we what we just discussed about participatory projects, you can get all the knowledge in a few days, but implementing it is a bit more complex. So I think that's on one. There's a lot of research on this topic. We're one of the partners or the drivers behind the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights. And it's a coalition where we, and there's a lot of talk about digital rights, and everything is really important, but we just only take one piece of this digital rights debate, and that's how we can exchange and operationalize this to cities. And there's also a working group on digital divide and how can you improve inclusive design, etc. And cities like Milan is a really leading inclusive design on citizen service. That's one example. I really like Portland was just mentioned. I think in the debate. I really like the view of Portland of not only looking at your own city, but looking at the city as a whole, because you can have really good inclusive design as a city service yourself, but most people only come to you once in a few years. So it's about when you order food, that should be an inclusive tool as well, because that's where the real digital divide is. People who cannot read, well, we're there to help when you come at our office, but other tools or infrastructures or companies are not always so. So I think that's good. So it's not only about big cities and small cities, it's more about government and non-government, etc. I think that's a larger divide where to focus on. And when it comes to small and larger cities, I think it's just a matter of searching each other, getting connected. In the Netherlands, we're working a lot on creating IT tools together with smaller and larger cities. And to be honest, I think a lot of things are happening way faster in smaller cities because it's speedier. So yeah, I think it's not only about, I mean, big cities, we do have budgets and people have time to think about this, but making a decision takes longer. So that's why it's really interesting for me actually to work at smaller cities. And that's where actually things happen more fast often.
Thank you so much for that answer. What I would also like to draw our attention to is a lot of these decisions are based on or informed decisions are based on data. And for me, it's always the question, information versus obfuscation, which information is helpful in your experience and which data carries challenges for civil liberties, human rights and equality. I saw recent examples, for instance, PropTech in New York, now connected with the Corona crisis, where data on renters is used to evict them, like ultimately, and also we all know about surveillance in cities and other senses that might be problematic. What are the most important civic tech tools to counter these developments?
Want to go first, Bianca?
I also thought Bianca should start on this because this is where the power should come in. I think Martin and I can provide examples, but
I do think this is a good example of something that's in flux, to be very honest, because I think two things. One, talking about data outside of its context, not particularly useful, and I think we've been doing that for a bit too long, is talking about data outside. It's data is only relevant to its environment and use. And so one of my colleagues, Sean McDonald, years ago sort of pushed me into thinking about, don't worry about ownership or don't worry about this, worry about use. Because what people really care about is how their data is being used. And so I think the second question, which comes out of the sidewalk example, and might be one of the things that it was unfortunate we didn't see more progress on, was the idea of a data trust. Because I think, and this is also based on some of Sean's work, where in the open movement we didn't talk about governance as much, a data trust is a way to create specific and narrow sort of terms of use that are done through stakeholder participation. So a data trust is not a software, it's not anything other than a way to organize people around a conversation for how their data is used. And I think that's an opportunity that we need to keep talking about, is what are the governance experiments we can do in technology? And I think that was unfortunate that didn't happen. I think that was one of those good outcomes from the sidewalk conversation, was to talk about that. Because, and this relates to both of your points and Martin's on time, there's a lot of talk about ethics, right? But I think there is this wonderful post that a colleague named Dan Monroe, he wrote about Feynman's error. It's called On Ethical Thinking and Drifting. And the thing is, with ethics, you need to keep going back to what you decided and checking if it still makes sense And that's what a structure of governance, and I think it's to both of your points around long-term and medium-term stakeholder engagement, you have to keep going back and check if something's working or not. Because I think most of the history of all of this data use has been click, forget, whatever. What do I do? I don't know. Do I file something with the privacy commissioner? How do I do that? I don't know. It's basically like it's taken for granted that no one will come back to the choice. So I think forcing, that was cool. Like he just ran into that. That like forcing the conversation through a governance. I kind of want you to keep doing that. It's like, I feel like I have to be like, over to you to comment on this now that you.
This is what I do all day, just to distract people. Sorry.
No, it's perfect. No, it's perfect. So, but this idea of using new governance, new governance structures like a data trust, I think is worth exploring. So, and I think that's why, because it gets at some of these things. We're not returning to the issues. We're not being specific enough. We know that this, like, I think the GDPR continues to stress me out because the GDPR hasn't resolved all of these problems by a long shot. So I think these universal approaches to data that take it out of context are not enough. I think it's good, it's an approach, but what are we doing about specific use? And I'd like to see more of our conversation there. And I think, again, cities are fantastic for that, because you can point people to where the use is, how they relate to it, where the commercial implication might be, where the, public implication might be. So that's my answer to that one. I'm curious what both of you think, what all of you think.
Just to focus the question a little bit more, I was also interested into the economic models that are proposed for more progressive, like data policy, as we heard in the Green New Deal, for instance, in the US, but also in Europe. There are different transnational groups working on it, and also economists like Jeremy Rifkin, for instance. And I was wondering if you have an opinion on that as well.
I need to read more of the work to comment specifically. I'll just say my generic comment is I don't think commodifying data, I think there's a lot of garbage in, garbage out, red herring data that has no value. And so I think commodifying it is a very slippery slope. I think we need to attach value to use. Mm-hmm. So the data itself is not the place in the chain of value to try to assign value. That's my high level kind of instinct. I'm always happy to interrogate models if there's more that I'm thanks for the prompt to be reading more into that. But at a high level, I'm highly concerned about commodifying data, mostly because I think a lot of it is useless, because it truly is useless, and we've gone too long with letting that narrative of so much value go. That's my take on that one.
For me, the three questions are really, they hang together. So the urban rural, or the segregation, the division, what you talk about, the profiling, which has always been part of local government, obviously, long before the digital data, and then the commercialization of data. I think now there is this naive vision that we have a city and then we have a cloud, and then we just connect the two. And I think that's exactly what you're, warning against, Bianca, what I hear. So I would point to a paradigm shift completely. Now we know what the cloud can do, connecting everything with everyone. And we also know, especially in Corona times, the challenges of connecting everyone with everyone. So actually, I see a complete shift now towards the edge. So I think the era of the cloud is not gone because it's there, but the era where the cloud was the answer to everything is clearly gone. We have seen data exchanges, the Copenhagen Data Exchange and so on. They don't work. And they don't work exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, Bianca, that this idea that data is something we can somehow monetize, it's broken. I mean, it's like monetizing air or water. Of course you can do it, but it's probably not a good idea. So what I see is, just as we have seen in very, very general learnings over the years, is that designing for the edge case, which might be the smaller community, the disenfranchised, the remote, where you don't have capacity, bandwidth, resource, is actually helping Amsterdam and Hamburg, tackling the challenges of divisions and a separated society. It's back to the curb cut. it was made as an accessibility thing for people in wheelchairs, but hey, it was great for bikes and for strollers and so on. So I think really, how do we manage data in a context, exactly like you say, Bianca, but I would also phrase it, data on the edge. And we should start there from the specific cases. But of course, we need somehow also to govern this as a whole, but not by naively just over-connecting. There's a reason why we have firewalls. And I don't mean the digital firewalls. I mean like the physical brick walls, so that our cities don't burn down, once in a while. There's a reason why we have social distancing through Corona, why we have circuit breakers in our electrical systems. We need to learn all of these things, and hopefully we get it without, burning our digital communities down once in a while. So I think for me, that's what's changing. This idea of data and the cloud as just a thing. No, it's real landscape that has to be available for political decision making, multi-level from citizen and up and around, without destroying the planet as we go, and while having a thriving economy, because Maslow's pyramid still holds. We can watch the US elections minute by the minute. So I would say design for the edge, and then learn how to scale that without, breaking the systems that work.
Yes, and to keep building on this, because then I have a prompt for Ike on this question, because you were reminding me of something, Martin. Agree with all of that. One of the things that makes me nervous about data is governments using as an excuse that they somehow keep needing more of it to do something. And I think this is very apparent in Ruha Benjamin's work. She calls it the datafication of injustice. Like, how much more do we need? Like how much, because I'm very concerned about time in relation to political incentive. And does this now, you need more and more and more, like when I think we have enough data to do a lot of things that we should have done in our cities and in our governments for people and equity for a long time. So I'm not really here to feel like we need so much more, but this is my question, and I'm always open to being wrong on the market.
Need way more. We need way more.
But this is what I want to know. Yeah, do you think so? Because the marginal value for me, I'm like, it's questionable to me, but I want to know from where you're living it, right? Like, what are you getting that's helping you every year with more and more and more?
I think it's not about more and more. Actually, we're having this debate in City Hall very lively at the moment for two reasons. One is we're working on a political data strategy, and that's why I slightly disagree with Martin's reference to data as water or air. And you can see air, and then I'm coming back to your question, Bianca. But if we see data as a sort of a commons, then everyone should be able to use it. So in our data strategy, and it's in a judicial way not really working out yet, so this won't be the final thing, but data about the city, about people, should be made public for use of the city. So there's a lot of data behind walls we cannot use. So somehow if the data is there, it should be accessible, maybe not always public, because of course there's some information you want to hold a little bit more private. But in the end, and why I'm saying this is because we're spending, and not we, but everyone, companies together, we're spending a lot on creating information, creating data. Very practical thing. They're driving, especially not in Germany because you banned the Google Maps car, but in the rest of the world, they're driving 5 or 6 LiDAR cars behind each other who are mapping every street a few times a year. We can do this more efficiently, also less privacy invasive. So I think it's thinking about how do we structure and resourcing data about cities. I think that's a question, and that's why I like the reference to water. Water, I mean, it's no one's, but in the end, yes, we do monetize it a bit because we have to pay for how we keep it clean and how we make sure that everyone makes decent use of it. That's one. The other one is about, and that's I think in line with do you need more data or not? It's more about the quality, and I really agree with the other part Martin said. Only gather it if you're actually going to use it, because we had a lot of talks about data exchanges in the past, and it was really slow. But now in the Corona crisis, actually we do fast forward when it comes to data exchange, because we do want to know if the sampling of the sewage, where we can find out if you have Corona early in a neighborhood or not, we want to access it more quick. And it shouldn't matter if it's a company or public agency, etc. So this the data exchange concept is going pretty fast. The other one is it can help us. And I'm definitely not an advocate of gathering more and more data. I really think we should have a purpose and a political responsibility for gathering data. But it's also about making use of it. An example: do people follow rules in a Corona era? How far are you willing to go? And I don't think that you should gather all the data to check that. I mean, there's also responsibility for people themselves, but it's a thin line. In Amsterdam, we had, and this is not a Corona example, it's 10 years ago, 1,000 people, 1,000 families were placed outside their homes every year because they didn't pay the rent. And we thought, okay, from a privacy perspective, we don't knock on doors of people because that's your own home. So as a city, we don't knock on your door. But then we started doing that, and we said, okay, please let's have a talk because it's not going very well with your financial situation. And that's privacy invasive. I mean, I think nowadays people would disagree if we would propose this idea, but now there are only 1, 2, maybe 3 families a year being sent away from their home, and I think that's a huge difference. So I think we should have these debate about how intrusive do you want to be about gathering data, and what's the purpose? And I think, and that's why I'm referring to a political data strategy. So the most of the talks about data are being like, how do we organize it, and how does the data exchange work, and I want your data, and what conditions can I use it, etc. But the political strategy should be about this, like who decides and who controls. And that's why I like the reference to what you said, the ethical perspective, looking back at the decisions you made earlier. With what purpose do you need it? And in that case, yes, sometimes we need more data. I think we do need that in some cases, but we should think wisely about why and who controls it, and when do you delete it again, etc.
As the final question of the panel already, and all of this was very, very interesting. How would you envision your respective city in 5 or 20 years, and what role do regulation and oversight technologies play in this future? To conclude,
You're the only one with the city.
I mean, you're speaking on behalf of, I think, 200 of them. So I think you can have a. No, I really think, I mean, if Martin is doing his work well, I mean, Martin is representing a lot of cities on more open and agile on these concerns. So I think you should definitely be able to answer this. I think this is a really, really, really tough question. I mean, 5, 10, 20 years. I think the era of disruptive, etc., and etc. That's what everyone read 5 years ago, like, okay, exponential world and everything is going to change and happen. And then people realized, okay, within a societal structure, everything is going a little bit more at a slow pace. If you ask people in the 70s, how would the 2020s looks like? You would have flying cars and everyone would have their individual mobility thing. Well, I can elaborate for a long time on how our mobility infrastructure is improving at the moment. It's not going to be before 2040, I think, before we have anything such as improvement on that part. So I think it's going way slower. I do think no, I have no clue. I really have no clue.
Then I rephrase for Martin. Martin, are there any non-Western centric cities that are smart cities, or like move along the guidelines of what a smart city in your opinion is, and impress you?
Yeah, I'm impressed by almost everywhere I come, and I travel a lot. Well, I used to travel a lot. And I think maybe just a comment on this smart city concept. I think we all agree that it's a problematic one, but in some way it has also covered something which is important, which is everything we've discussed now. it's yeah. So I mean, we can mention Helsinki and Amsterdam and many more as front runners. And I think first of all, because they are doing things, they are open. So when they put budget to something, they reserve some of the budget to share and do things with others, because otherwise we'd be reinventing the wheel, you know, on a scale that we don't want to, right? So back to where are we all in 15, 20 minutes? I mean, plus minus some geopolitical stability would be great. I think, so if this was like a Tour de France, we had the first route or the first day where everybody's excited. That was the first sort of smart cities. Yeah, we can do things with data. And then we had a very long, where couple of days where nothing happened. But I think with the Corona situation and with what is happening now, especially in Europe on the digital and the green digital twin transformation, which is being resourced by the Corona sources, 20%. I think we are now entering a time where a lot will happen in the next couple of years. And then I think we will basically see a generation working on this, in public service, in the companies, in the civic movements. So I would expect in a generation, we have found some of the balances in how to do this, but I actually hope that our cities don't change so much. I mean, that would be the ideal, but with less pollution, less, all the political goals we have along the triple baseline, social, environmentally, and economically. So exactly as Bianca said, let's look at what did we want? Okay, good lives, great. I hope lives have improved somewhat, but hopefully, I think actually the baseline would be, let's hope that they have not declined.
And I've got a really quick one, because from Toronto, another great outcome from the sidewalk thing was that the city of Toronto is making a digital infrastructure plan. So it has created that, it in that vacuum, it was like, oh wait, how do we organize this? So I just want to make 2 quick points on that. One of them is budgetary. And Ike, I think with the water situation, one thing that cities and governments need to get away from is just because you have to support water services, it doesn't mean you have to draw the revenue against the water. So when we talk about commercializing, because I think this is very standard in governments, is that you have to put your revenue against your asset, right? Like you have to figure out how you commercialize. And I think we need to rethink that sometimes. And I'm not suggesting you were saying that you're commercializing water all over the place, but I've seen that in the open data movement is people being, trying to hold on. You need revenue to support these data infrastructures, but don't be literal and pull it from the commodity itself, if that makes sense. We need to budget. Martin, I love that idea of capacity to talk with other cities. Like we need to budget to support this stuff. So there's an element of budgetary thinking that needs to be reorganized. And then the second piece, which I hope everybody who works in government takes to heart, working in human resources and organizational design, to me, is where it was where this is going to get really exciting in the next decade, is how do you enable within existing legislation cross-departmental collaboration. We have a Westminster system in Canada where accountability has to stay up a line. And I think that causes both trouble and also is really important. So I think there's a lot to dig into there, and that's not data or technology, it's humans and how they work together and how you really, grow and develop capacity within city and other levels of government. So I just want to double down on that one. And I think Amsterdam's done a lot of that, like these are the things we need to want people to work at the city in technology. That should be like one of their top choices, to go and work there because they're excited about it. So that's where I see a lot of it. Like to me, it's such an exciting place to be and to work. In that organizational piece.
Maybe, Catherine, can I add one small thing to what Bianca said? Because we're not talking about the revenue thing, but I do agree. So one thing, and it's not a statement from the city of Amsterdam, because I think it's the idea of a few people, but how do we point this out? So we think it's normal that we have people in our public service who know everything about pavement and trees, etc. But how do we, on the next budget, how do we support this idea that we should spend 20 million on how do we organize data in our city without a revenue model? And I haven't been able to put arguments together. So if anyone listening has somewhere risen this in a bit of a structured way, I'm really keen on getting that. And the other answer is about the 5 years. I've got no clue, but one of the things we're aiming for is, yes, we're doing good things in Amsterdam, but it's mainly about the public service itself. In 5 years, can I say that all the technology in the city of Amsterdam, so public space, companies, etc. included, is trustworthy? We're having a lot of talks about trustworthy AI and responsible AI, but can I walk around as a citizen and know for sure that all the technology used around me in public space is trustworthy? Again, this is a thought and we're trying to work it, but we're searching for arguments and how does it work and how do you structure this? So I've got this huge image of Hamburg. So maybe someone listening is saying, okay, I've already written this down. Please reach out, because in 5 years, I think this is one of the most important things we should do before we can talk about what's happening in 10 years.
Fully agree. I mean, the transparency and the accountability of public service, just look at the US election right now. That's the big discussion. It's the big discussion in Europe. It's the big discussion in China and everywhere. So we're down to politics. So let's hope that technology is still within the reach of politics.
Thank all of you so much for this food for thought. Let's keep collaborating, talking, and also stand and share our ideas. I have to zoom over to Hamburg again because there's a reading upcoming now, and let's keep in touch. I'm sure the audience can approach you on Twitter, for instance, to elaborate and share ideas and discuss further. And again, thank you very much for being part of this panel. It was very impressive to learn from all of your respective views. Thank you.
Hat euch das Video gefallen? Dann abonniert unseren Kanal, um kein Video zu verpassen. Schaut gern auch in unserer Mediathek vorbei auf körber-stiftung.de/Mediathek und folgt uns auf Facebook, Instagram und Twitter. Danke fürs Zuschauen und bis bald.